summer's afternoon. We're here kind of at the end of the first week of August. I didn't check the temperature before I come on, but it feels like 33, 34, 35, maybe even 36 degrees Celsius today. It is scorching. Hopefully my camera doesn't fail on my iPhone for this live stream. So I'm going to give you a bit of an update of what things are like here on the ground in Odesa, and a Russo-Ukrainian war update, especially what's not been talked about maybe in the mainstream media or the alt media in general, what's behind the headlines that you've probably seen. Recently, we have big changes in the military leadership and in the defense ministry. Actually, a lot of the senior bureaucratic positions in Ukraine. So the new commander-in-chief, we have it looks like going to be a new minister of defense. Doesn't look like Fedorov is going to come back. That was speculated on. I'll make a longer video about that in the coming days. And in terms of the war, there's very little movement on the front lines. The Russian summer offensive 2026 is effectively stillborn. It has, I don't know what the net gain that they take per day. It's maybe a square kilometer, maybe even less at this point. So they're obviously not going to achieve anything strategic in the short term. It even looks like, even taking Donbass at this rate, they wouldn't take, I don't know if they need 4, 5, or 10 years at this point. So in terms of any sort of strategic investment by Moscow, it looks pretty much pointless at this stage. What they have shifted to is firing lots of ballistic missiles at primarily civilian targets, also some dual-use targets and some military targets here in Ukraine. Ukraine has developed probably the best air defense in the world for dealing with these Shahed/Geran drones. They were an Iranian drone that was developed then or upgraded between Russia and Iran. And I've noticed that here in Odesa over the last 2 months, the number of Shahed attacks seems to have dropped considerably, because Ukraine has such good air interceptors that, yes, some drones do get through, but they're very few at this point. What Russia has ramped up is firing more and more of these ballistic missiles. Obviously, they're more powerful, more accurate, and more destructive, but they are vastly more expensive. So for an economy like Russia, which is effectively teetering on the brink of a major implosion at this stage, because they've started this war back in 2014, so already the economy has been suffering since then, but since 2022 it's really ratcheted up. So Russian economy is in a lot of trouble in spite of the best efforts of the central banker in Russia. There's not much more she can do. Someone who should probably face the legal consequences of her aid for this war in the fullness of time, but that's another topic. With Russia now spending more and more on these ballistic missiles, it's also incentivized by the fact that Ukraine is better and better able to defend against the drones, plus they have a shortage of interceptors. Since I said that yesterday before that there was like over a dozen people killed in Kyiv Oblast in these attacks, that they're basically running out of them, and that the US, obviously Trump started this ill-advised war in the Middle East. Well, at least he's executed it in a pretty poor manner, since his special military operation there didn't last 3 days like I guess he expected. And now, how many months are we into it? It must be almost 6 months at this point, with no end in sight, no realistic end. I know he talks and says lots of things every day, but it doesn't seem like it's going to end anytime soon, which surprised me, especially with the midterms coming up in the US. However, Ukraine's partners, European allies, plus the US, they just basically don't have the reserves, and not willing to give Ukraine more of those to shore up Ukrainian air defenses in the short term, especially for the European partners. That is a huge mistake, because they need Ukraine to succeed, and Ukraine having this air defense is a massive problem in the short term. In the medium term, Ukraine is working on its own alternative to the Patriot. Trump had said that he was going to give a license to produce a Patriot. I'd be skeptical to ever see it happen. The guy says a lot of stuff and then flip-flops, non-stop. So him saying something basically not really, it's not really worth very much at this point. But then, yeah, so he went back in it already. He's suddenly saying he wasn't going to give the rights to produce. Maybe they will get the rights, who knows? But it's an idea that's out there. That's all we can say for now. And Ukraine will basically be pushing ahead and developing their alternative called the Freya. How long it is before they can develop that, very hard to say. I don't think it's going to be possible with any time span realistically to defend Ukraine this winter. So this is going to be a very tough winter for Ukraine. I also don't see Russia or Vladimir Putin stopping the fighting now. he's basically thinks he can still somehow take Donbass. He keeps apparently making these demands of these generals to take it by this date and that date. Obviously, they fail miserably to achieve that objective, but then he just extends the deadline. And it looks like they're going to use as much of these ballistic missiles as they have in stock, and they're obviously ramping up the production. And they're also getting some of them from North Korea, with North Koreans apparently already, according to Ukrainian intelligence, ready to fire them. So this is going to cause huge problems for Ukraine and the civilians in particular, with things like water supply, electricity, maybe even food supply this winter. Russia is under increasing pressure because Ukraine's military just keeps ramping up and innovating quicker than Russia can. So Ukraine now has domestically produced munitions that are striking Russia. So you've seen the wild berries, which are dual-use facilities. Of course, their primary and their official function is to be some sort of online marketplace for suppliers in the Russian Federation, some other countries, but in reality, they also were helping the war effort by, you could order lots of military equipment online, and they were quite proud of it. And even their CEO went on, started calling the Ukrainians terrorists. Well, that probably means that wild berries is going to be eliminated as a company. I think the Ukrainians are just going to blow up the rest of it in the next few days. If you're looking behind that headlines about what's going on, apparently it is heavily indebted to a state bank. So basically it's a way of weakening the state bank that presumably will then need a bailout from the Russian state. Of course, that means that the bill will ultimately fall with the Russian state to a certain extent, which of course will weaken Russia's ability to prosecute the war. Even though oil prices are higher than they were before with this war in the Middle East, they are actually producing way less of their petroleum products because Ukraine is able to hit their refineries and other production facilities. So what we're seeing is Ukraine continuously ramping up, becoming more and more domestically sufficient with help from the European allies and less from the US. I'm not really sure what the US is actually helping with. If it's not going to be Patriots this stage, I get some intelligence and some other weapons that are being bought indirectly through the European partners. But effectively, there's politically leaning towards helping Russia, but actually they still provide something to the Ukrainians, but it's less and less. If you compare it to the Biden administration, obviously it's a huge gap in capability that Europe has managed to plug somewhat, but basically Ukraine's are building this enormous defense industry. And in fact, the former head of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, commander of the Ukrainian forces, Valery Zaluzhny, he said a couple of days ago that Ukraine will never join NATO. And actually, it doesn't almost make sense at this stage because the doctrine that Ukraine is using for this war has now diverged so much from the NATO doctrine. The NATO doctrine hasn't been updated for dealing with a war. I mean, basically, the main war that NATO potentially would have to deal with is a Russian invasion of a NATO state. And they don't update their doctrine quick enough. And basically, the Ukrainians are the ones that are way ahead on that. Of course, would the U.S. actually come to aid its allies substantially with soldiers and troops and material, actually send their own tanks and aircraft to defend somewhere like Latvia and Estonia? Very unlikely, in my opinion, at this stage under Donald Trump. So you're looking at primarily the Western members of NATO with some others like Canada, and we'll count Turkey as European for the purpose of this conversation. And if you look at that compared to the Ukrainian armed forces, because Ukraine by necessity has had to fight Russia for the last almost 5 years in this high-intensity, hot conflict, the gap in capabilities is starting to narrow, and in some domains Ukraine is ahead of its European partners, and that means that it's becoming more and more like the rest of Europe needs Ukraine militarily more than Ukraine needs the rest of Europe, to a certain extent, obviously in terms of know-how and strategy, and a lot of the increasing a lot more of the actual material as well, like drone interceptors. So in grosso modo, we're seeing change in strategy by both sides. And at the moment, the main focus is not on the front lines because not much is going to change. Neither side can get a substantial advantage ahead of the other to make a big gain in territory with the new commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces. It seems like less likely that Ukraine will go in a counter-offensive than under Syrskyi, who's been replaced. But we'll have to see what happens there, and the Russians will keep losing huge amounts of troops. The latest update from the front is that I think the last month was the most expensive in terms of loss of casualties for the Russian forces, plus the ratio is catastrophic in terms of human life on the Russian side. There's alleged to be losing over 40,000 troops a month. They cannot recruit that many in Russia at the moment, hence why almost certainly Putin will be forced to go for mobilization in late September or late October. But also the ratio to killed to wounded in that casualty statistic is now 60% are alleged to be KIA and only 40% wounded. And the reason for that is that they are sending small infiltration groups. They are hunted down by drones primarily, and the chances of being evacuated from the battlefield is very slim if you're on the Russian side. That is why their killed to wounded ratio is so lopsided historically. Like, if you look at how the US has fought or its allies in wars, they normally have like 1 death to maybe 15 or 20 casualties. Russia has more deaths than wounded at this point because they can't evacuate anyone, and it is so lethal to be hit by an FPV drone on the front lines, and they're the ones advancing most of the time, so they're just going to take the bulk of the casualties. Last time we heard the ratio of Ukrainian KIA to Russian KIA was from Marco Rubio a month or two ago, and he said it's now 5-1, so Russia's 5 more times KIA than Ukraine. You have to also then extrapolate for that if what the Ukrainians are saying in terms of the ratio, it means that probably the casualty figure itself isn't that much more. It's not 5-1 in terms of casualties, it's KIA, so probably it's closer to maybe about 3-1 in terms of the casualties. So Russia about 3 times more versus Ukraine. That's just a back of the envelope extrapolation from what the publicly available information is, and of course it may also not be accurate. However, it seems to coincide with the trends that we've seen throughout this war. So as things get worse and worse for Russia, I think the overarching point that you should take behind the headlines is we need to be prepared for the Moscow Empire and the Muscovite Empire getting smaller. Putin has the Russian Federation on a trajectory where its economy is going to start to fail. They're not going to have a strategic victory in Ukraine, and at that point things probably start to ravel to a certain point within the Russian Federation, and there will be, some parts of the regions, people in the region will start to take power. It could be warlords, it could be a coup d'etat in Moscow itself, but it's going to really weaken the central nature of the Russian state. When I say comparison, obviously the Soviet Union and Moscow, they lost the war in Afghanistan, the Soviet-Afghan war, which didn't have anything like the casualties for the Soviet Union like this did, but because it was actually more open almost in terms of the public being able to express their dissatisfaction in the Soviet Union at the time, late Soviet Union, than in Putin's Russia, it unraveled obviously quite quickly afterwards. They had the same issues, decline in living standards, weak economy because of a weak economy, the war that went wrong, and you're seeing that play out now here in Ukraine for the Russian Federation. So that's the big overarching idea to take out of this is the West needs to start preparing for some sort of collapse in Russia. Not that it will 100% happen. Of course, you could have a strong man that keeps it together, but it is more and more likely as we go along. And Russia is no closer to victory than before. It'll be interesting to see over the winter the resilience between the two populations. Ukrainians obviously have something to fight for, which is the ability to beat Ukraine and have their own country independent of Moscow. What are Russians fighting for? And that will become increasingly difficult to justify as Moscow in particular has issues with inflation rising, drone attacks. So just the whole fear factor of things getting blown up in the city. The war will not seem so far away as it has done before. Plus, Ukraine may actually hit a lot of their electricity and heating this winter, which could leave a lot of Russians without those bare essentials during the winter. We just have to see what happens, but that would seem to be the next evolution. Russia's been doing that here since 2022 and claiming it's all fine and dandy. So what goes around comes around is probably what is likely to happen to a certain extent this winter. And will the Muscovite society be as resilient as a lot of people tell me? And I haven't been to Moscow for a long time. Obviously, this war I'm not planning to go. But there's this belief that the Russians will just put up with everything. But we are talking about a post-Soviet Moscow where people got used to a lot better quality of life than before. And a lot of people did become wealthy. It's kind of like what I call an island of prosperity within Russia. Russia is basically a dump, most of it. But there are these pockets of, vast wealth that's been, basically looted from the rest of the country to a large extent. And you have a certain amount of the middle class as well. But the middle class and the upper middle class is really going to suffer as we go into the winter of 2026 into next year. If we come out of this, as I expect, with Russia having blown up a lot of stuff in Ukraine, committed a lot of atrocities, been known closer to a strategic victory in Ukraine. The strategic objective would be taking all of Donbass. I think that's basically fantasy at this point, but what Putin still thinks he's going to get. We will get into next spring. Russian economy will really be in a bad place at that point. There could be a lot of unrest in Russia if they've gone through the winter with, rising inflation, weakening economy, no end in sight for their war of imperial aggression against Ukraine, perhaps having problems with getting basic products. I don't know what's going to happen to the rest of their delivery systems, electricity, heating. Their own government is already clamping down their ability to use the internet. So, and we saw a little bit of pushback from many online influencers about that because it was affecting their business, that people weren't able to use the internet properly and the different apps that they sell through. So, could see everything coming to a head by about next spring. There's also a guy I follow who's a geopolitical or geostrategist called Dmitry Alperovich. He's born in the Soviet Union and naturalized American, and he's been pretty accurate in describing or predicting how the war would unfold. He has a good track record, and he thinks by next spring, basically, that Putin's going to be forced to go for a ceasefire because it will be untenable. And the big question is then, does Ukraine even accept? At the moment, Zelensky's saying he will, but you also have to play it out a little bit that maybe he also has intel from his own security services that Putin has no intention of going for a ceasefire. So he can just say, I'm going to go agree to a ceasefire without actually it being necessarily a final taken decision now. But that's just me speculating to a certain extent. I'm obviously not privy to those conversations, but we will see at that point. I think personally, and also Igor Girkin, the Russian ultranationalist who sits in a Russian prison, who is convicted in absentia, a war criminal, going back to how this war started in 2014. He sits in a Russian prison not because he's an opponent of this war. He's actually a huge supporter of it, but he's an opponent to the incompetence, in his opinion, of Vladimir Putin, which I share. I think strategically he's incompetent, fortunately from the Ukrainian point of view, but unfortunately from his point of view. And he also thinks mobilization won't be a game changer. It's too late. He should have done it years ago. He also thinks the Russian economy is getting, and people are, he's speculating, he's not an economist, but he probably has enough connections, and he's also been a good analyst of this war so far in terms of a lot of the faults with the Russian strategy. Unfortunately, I guess we got the best of both worlds. One, we can listen to him because Putin hasn't killed him yet, like Navalny, but at the same time, he's sitting in a Russian prison and he's not able to affect the outcome of the war too much, which is good from our point of view here in Odesa and in free Ukraine. He also thinks that 1 year to maybe 18 months tops, the Russian economy can keep going. And that seems to be a consensus opinion that I've seen from different sources analyzing that by the end of next year, basically, they're toast, maybe even sooner. So probably late spring would be the last chance that Putin has. Now, around that time, interestingly, there will be presidential elections in France. And you see how the support that Ukraine gets from its allies varies widely, with the vicissitudes of democracy. People get fed up one leader to vote another one. Some are pro-Ukrainian, some are not pro-Ukrainian. Some are even leaning pro-Russian, or even more or less overtly pro-Russian, like Orban was in Hungary. And obviously Orban is gone, which was good for Ukraine. And Trump getting elected compared to Harris, and that negative for Ukraine, positive for Russia. But Trump is so mercurial that, even if he were to be trying to help Russia, he probably messed it up anyways, judging by how he's executed this folly of a war in the Middle East so far. And with those elections, if Marine Le Pen were to win in France, you would see a politician in a major European country that has been associated with Russia in the past, Russian banks, whatever, loaned her party money back in the day, who is not likely to be as supportive as Ukraine as President Macron has been in France. For all his faults, Macron, I always think he talks a better game than he actually delivers in terms of actually concurrently supporting Ukraine, but they are going to supply Rafale planes, for example. This will be a major issue for Ukraine as well. Will it be a game changer? I don't think it will turn the tide of the war concretely back or determinedly back in Russia's favor. However, the fact that she might get elected could instill renewed confidence in Putin that he just has to wait it out until enough of these maybe not all pro-Russian candidates in European or North American capitals get elected, but at least ones that are not so supportive of Ukraine, and he can kind of cut off the support for Ukraine. Ukraine is very heavily dependent on money from its European partners. Increasingly, it's able to develop its own, jointly with its Western partners or independently, the materiel itself. Obviously, they need also personnel to fight the war. So that's another thing they're working on, reform of the mobilization process here. That's one thing that Syrski was criticized for, and Fedorov also, as part of to do with his dismissal, was that the reforms apparently weren't quick enough. Whether that's true or not or justified, it's hard for me to say, but those are all things that would give Putin, maybe he's going to keep going. He's making bad decisions for most of this war strategically. He didn't make a good decision on waiting to see if Trump would get elected, because obviously Trump hasn't helped Ukraine and there's a lot of shenanigans going on in the background. Like his two main negotiators have never been to Kyiv still. And they're complete to incompetence, my favorite word for describing this administration and foreign policy. Like they're over there in Moscow believing that they have agreements, not bringing even their own official State Department translators. In Stevie Witkoff's case, they don't have the credentials. They're realtors. I mean, I take advice from them about investing in real estate in Florida, but for how to solve the biggest war in Europe since World War II, these guys should be nowhere near it. But that is the situation we're in, and Putin correctly gambled on Trump winning over Harris from that point of view. But it hasn't been enough. He still hasn't made that much progress. He's still in a worse position domestically. And the further he goes along, the harder and harder it is to extract himself and survive in power, since this war is such a train wreck without a strategic objective. So I think it's possible he's going to keep making bad mistakes and not go for a ceasefire in the spring. I said at the beginning of the year, 50-50 that we come to some sort of temporary pause in the fighting, at least in 2026, rising to 80% in 27, mainly based on the Russian economy and it going south. Here we are, we're over halfway through 2026. Who could still go for a ceasefire, but it looks more likely he's going to go for a mobilization end of September, just have to have some sham election where he gets anointed, or I think it's in the parliament. It's not really important, but it is performative in the Russian authoritative system that there are elections and that people stamp their approval in some shape or form, at least a section of the populace, on whatever Putin is doing. Obviously, there's going to be no actual real political competition there. So he will probably, it looks like, go for mobilization. At least they set up everything in that direction at that point. And even though the Ukrainians are saying that they're trying to push, make the pain so much that he'll actually go for a ceasefire by the winter, but I think I'd put that as low probability, maybe a 25%, 20 to 30% probability. You're probably going to push through that. There's also a possibility he goes for in the Baltic states, but I think he'd really need to call a ceasefire in Ukraine first before he could think of doing that. So I don't think that's going to happen. I think we get into next spring, it'll still be an absolute train wreck. The Russian economy in a way worse position. But something like a Marine Le Pen victory in the elections could just, he's like a drunk in not the roulette table. So he may even go down again and gamble. And then, yeah, by the end of 2027, I think the fighting will stop anyways, because I think it'll just be such unbearable cost to the Russian society and its economy. His economy will implode. At that point, he'll probably be removed from power, and whoever comes to power will want to at least oppose in the fighting, even if they're not going to be that, not going to show much contrition towards Ukraine for having started this war and destroyed so much of the futures for both Ukraine and Russia. So that is my update on everyday life here. It is a dichotomy, I guess, what you see in the headlines versus reality on the ground. In spite of what goes on, in spite of the horrific attacks, we do have curfew from midnight to 5 a.m. And other than that, and other than air defense, not being able to take down these ballistic missiles, life goes on. As you see behind me, got the iconic Odesa Opera House. And yeah, there's just lots of people, mainly domestic tourists. International tourism is down, over 90% down. It's only a fraction of before, which means the hordes of the horny foreigners used to come here and chase the pretty Ukrainian girls on holiday. They are a thing of the past. I guess that's about the only silver lining for being in Odessa in 2026 in that sense. But yeah, life goes on. Cards work. If you come here, restaurants, cafes, everything is open during the day, basically. Life goes on remarkably. In terms of inflation, in euros or dollars, there's probably no real inflation here. There is a bit in hryvnia, but it weakened also over the course of the war. And in terms of so far, in spite of the targeting of some of the foodstuffs here, I don't see really that much evidence of inflation. It's actually a little bit odd. I tried to also look in the supermarket, but things go up a little bit in price and then they come back down again. So it's a little bit hard. Like it looked like there's been inflation about a month ago, and then it seemed to come back down again when I looked at the prices. So in hryvnia, I'm not talking about in Europe, but actually what I see written there. So yeah, I mean, for those who want to come here and support Ukraine at this time of need, and obviously this is a place to be. You can help the humanitarian efforts, you can help the defense of the country in any way you can. You can also come here and spend your money and document your trip here. You know, you can be a mini influencer and show people back home within your social circle. You don't need to be a huge YouTuber or influencer, you know, Instagram or TikToker to do it, but just showing people the reality, someone that they know, that they can trust, and this is what the reality is on the ground. This is what is actually like in 2026. We have a fantastic summer in terms of the weather. Hopefully the winter isn't going to be so cold as it was last winter. Was extremely cold and extremely tough. And yeah, people are at the beach, in the beach clubs. It's pretty remarkable. And actually the Russians are doing the same. And obviously Ukraine isn't targeting them as much as the civilian population is targeted here. But at the same time, it is kind of remarkable in the biggest war in Europe that this can still go on. At least for now, that is the situation. Let me look at your comments and questions if I'm able to read them, because I always have a problem. Maybe it's my, yeah, I always have to take it up. And I forgot that I have my phone in German, so I got to translate it. But not November in September 500. Canadier. Es wird passieren, dass die Okay, so top G mindset coach. It's, oh man, I'm forgetting. Is your name Jake? Or am I getting mixed up? Sorry. You know, it's obviously Hoffit. That's yeah, you predict that actually the 500,000 will be mobilized. That is the figure that is being suggested by Ukrainian intelligence for September, but you think they will actually be used against the Baltic states? I think it's very hard to imagine with the war still going on in Ukraine. If he does that kind of escalation and he doesn't call a ceasefire in Ukraine, Jack, that's it, Jack, yeah. So I was almost there, just off with the order of one syllable. So Jack, yeah, that's also possible. I just think, I mean, again, Putin makes for sure that you're wrong because, yeah, he might go for that, but I just can't see the other European allies of, say, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia not coming to the aid, and also the Ukrainians. I don't think Russia win. I think they get their asses spanked very quickly because it will just be such a priority. Do I think that Trump will come with troops and eject them? No, I don't predict that happening. I think he'll shout obscenities and probably blame whoever got invaded for not cutting a deal or some idiotic response, because that's what he's suggests he's going to do. Now, if I'm wrong, I'll be delighted if he suddenly sends US troops and they kick the Ruskies out of whatever new territory that they're trying to occupy in NATO. That would actually justify NATO still existing, giving a raison d'etre. If he were to do that, what would happen? You'd probably see him prove that the US security umbrella isn't very effective, but they will probably get ejected, which means they basically probably have plausible deniability that they were there. Oh, they don't have insignia on them. We don't know who those people are, suddenly occupying a small town in eastern Latvia, we'll say. But they'll get kicked out, and it will be clear to everybody in Europe that Trump, well, let's take the scenario, Trump doesn't send troops, doesn't honor Article 5 like it was expected, then people are going to say, well, we don't need the US because they don't provide any security to us, and then diplomatic relations are going to get even worse between the US and Europe. So that would be something that Putin would be interested in. But then he'll have been defeated by bloody Latvia at that point, which will be humiliating, and I don't see him surviving. And Putin's number one priority is to continue in power, because from his perspective, he's not in power, he's a dead man walking. So I don't think he will do it, but maybe he gets bad intelligence, maybe he makes another stupid strategic decision and he goes for town Latvia. That's what I think will happen. Then we take scenario 2, if Trump actually decides to honor Article 5 and sends out some American fighters and planes, artillery, troops on the ground, boots on the ground. It will prove that NATO stays together, would bring back relations between Europe and the US, solidify everything. So that would be a huge problem for Putin. And he would, of course, get his ass kicked then even quicker. So yeah, I think he's done. So that would be a huge gamble. He's gambling on U.S. not coming to the support of its allies. So tick for proving that Article 5 U.S. security umbrella doesn't really amount to much, a bit like the Budapest Memorandum. But then he must be gambling that he will actually be able to hold on to the territory. They won't end up in a military defeat. And I just don't see that happening. I think Ukrainians will come to the aid. Also, probably as a priority, they will do their best to even lead the response to kick out the Russian troops. They will come with their know-how, and Russia will be humiliated in the Baltic region. That's what I see more likely to happen. Now, of course, we're dealing with the probability we will try that, Jack. So, yeah, he's made so many. I said before the invasion, for example, in 2022, I made a video on the main lifestyle channel in late 2021 saying he'd have to be mad, basically, go and do this with an invasion of Ukraine. And that was even anticipating that he would get a lot further in terms of controlling Ukraine than he has. So he made bad decisions, and he's continued to make bad decisions. He could have withdrawn the troops back to at least the line of control in February 2022 at any time in the first few months, and he would have gotten away with it. He could have just made something about, we killed the Nazis in inverted commas in Ukraine and blah, 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 blah. Now, yeah, go Russia, and it would have been fine. But now, after almost 5 years of this train wreck, the economy about, basically teetering on the brink of collapse in the next 18 months max, he doesn't have that option anymore if he wants to stay in power, or at least from his perception. So, yeah, maybe he goes for that. He thinks, I can't beat the Ukrainians, but I just don't see that happening. I think he will still believe he can defeat the Ukrainians if he just throws enough troops at the front lines in Donbass, and he'll lose 500,000 more men maybe in the space of a year, but he'll think he'll get there, and it's likely he won't get there, and he'll lose the 500,000. That, with a collapsing economy by the end of 2027, makes me believe that very unlikely the war is going to go on longer. That's why I said back in January it was only a 20% chance that by the end of 2027 that the war would still be going on without a temporary ceasefire at least. So that is where I stand. I don't see any reason to change that at this juncture. Let me see, next comment. Jack again. Looks sites on Article 5, some info. Corporal P, wer den Krieg fortsetzen oder das Pferd intern abgesetzt. Ja. Maybe tell me, Jack, how likely, because your man is also very knowledgeable about these things, how likely you think that an expedition, a new special military operation, I'm almost fatalistically saying that it's going to fail if I call it a special military operation. How long do you think that has any chance of success in the Baltic region? Do you think that in those two scenarios that Trump honors Article 5 or doesn't honor Article 5? Let's say both of them, because I see very little chance of success either way. I just think enough other allies will come to Ukraine's aid, or to the Baltic states' aid, and that will include Ukraine. So, yeah, I just don't see it happening successfully. I think they'll launch an incursion. Ukraine will send help very quickly in terms of helping Estonia, Latvia, whatever it is. The Swedes and the Finns will send troops. We'll have to see how France reacts, maybe the Germans and Poles. Why does Poland let Russia get a big bridgehead on its border? I don't think so. If they go for the Suwalki Cup, I just don't see it happening. Even with the current Polish president not being particularly helpful to Ukraine, I think already the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister are enough to shore up Polish support. Poland also has elections that will be in, I think, the autumn of 2027. So we'll have to see what happens. The opposition to the right is now splintered a little bit, so it's unclear who will be in the driving seat to win those. But the current government is like a center-to-center, I guess center-right coalition, and then the opposition is more a center-right to hard-right coalition in general. Then you have the far-right to right, and then you have the far-left to the other side of the ruling party. If you have any other comments and points, drop them down below. Let's see. Someone's asking me linguistically about Which language is best learned to be understood everywhere? Pick a language in the middle, I guess, where you want to travel. So if you want to travel, in Polish, you could probably understand people in Slovakia, and then obviously Ukraine, but you won't understand Russian very well. So just depends where you want to travel. If you see yourself as maybe Slovak would be better in Bratislava. If you want to hang out in Czechia, Slovakia, and maybe Poland. So pick somewhere, I guess, geographically in the middle, since it's a continuum. Like Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Polish are vocabulary-wise very similar to each other, much more similar to each other than Ukrainian is with Russian, for example. So another comment down below. Okay, so you see the price, the cost of the war. Okay, lads, any more comments and questions? It is a beautiful afternoon or early evening in Odessa. We have a little bit of ambrosia here at the moment, so I take medication for the last few days, so I don't have this bad an allergy, but it also has a little bit of not feeling 100% the first few days I take it. And it's a choice between pest and cholera, as the Germans would say. Between plague, the devil in the deep blue sea, which one? Because obviously being here with the allergy also sucks. Thanks, Jack. Jack, are you coming to Ukraine anytime this summer? Are you currently in Ukraine? Where are you at the moment? I know we've spoken many times over the last few years. If you're looking for help with coming here, of course, I help my clients in person. There's the New York experience. You can find details of that if you go. Actually, I don't have the link to that down below. I have my consulting link down below, and also for the guidebook for coming here to Ukraine. So you can tap into my encyclopedic knowledge for. And I have my hospitality guide for Kyiv, Odessa, Lviv, Chernovtsi, and Uzhhorod. Those are 5 cities that I've gone to even since 2022. I had the biggest channel on YouTube for a high-level lifestyle here in Ukraine between 20 and 2022, obviously during COVID up until the invasion. And I have the consulting as well. You can go and check that out down below if you want to jump on a call together. If you want to come here with me in person, my email is connor@connorklein.com. You can also go and check out my website, connorklein.com, and there you have, I don't think I put the link down below at the moment, but for this channel, but you have my in-person version if you actually want me to guide you here in person on elite status. So those are all the options that I help my clients with at the moment. Okay, so you're delayed in coming back here, Jack. Well, hopefully you come here pretty soon. Shoot me a message when you do, obviously, on one of these live streams or on Instagram. And I think with that, I'm going to wrap it up. For watching this in replay, drop your comments down below. Any other questions you have about the situation here on the ground in Ukraine. As I said, I plan to make some more content, not necessarily just these live streams. These live streams are the easiest to make. I just turn on the camera and I show you live what's going on behind me. So I think it's pretty good content already, but maybe for some of the other videos that delve into a certain topic, I'll put those just as standalone videos on this channel in the coming days. And of course on my other channel, Connor Klein New Europe Experience, that most of you I think are familiar with, and there you can also learn about countries, especially with a perspective to spend 3 to 12 months per year, especially if you have a partner from this region or you're a single guy. It is the region I think is the best in Europe for sure, if not the world. A little bit of disagreement online about that, but so countries like Moldova, not just Ukraine, but Moldova, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Kazakhstan, and Romania are the countries that I document so far. Was thinking of going over to Czechia and also documenting Prague and Czechia, but haven't got around to it yet. So we're sticking to these countries for now, especially with a perspective for when Ukraine is rebuilt post-war with what looks like going to be the biggest reconstruction effort since World War II. So on that note, I'm from Ukrainian Farmer Forces, alluding back to my Irish heritage. I was going to say it in Romanian for Sarabuna, but do pobачення, гарна вечера, слава Україні, and